The wind off the Gulf of Alaska cut like glass that morning. Gray clouds pressed low over the water, the kind that promised rain, but never warned how sudden it would come. Beneath them, the river swelled with life, thousands of salmon mussel and silver thrashing upstream against the current. Dr. Eli Turner crouched on the slick rocks, his camera balanced on a tripod notebook, open boots sinking into the moss. He had been in the field for 12 days documenting salmon migration patterns for a marine ecology project. But what he saw that morning wasn't in any research log or wildlife manual. Out there where the tide met the river, something moved. Not a bear, not a human. A wolf standing chest-deep in the icy current. Eli blinked hard. Another appeared. Then another. A whole pack scattered across the shallows, their wet fur clinging dark to lean bodies. They weren't chasing deer or elk like inland wolves, they were fishing. One snapped its jaws beneath the surface and came up thrashing with a salmon in its teeth. Another used its paw to slap a fish onto the bank. For a moment, Eli forgot the cold. He forgot the warnings taped to every ranger post. Do not approach wolves. Maintain distance. Report sightings immediately. Instead, he reached for his camera breath, fogging the lens. A roar of thunder rolled across the valley. The next second, his boot slipped. The camera toppled, and Eli plunged straight into the freezing river. The shock hit like an electric surge. His backpack dragged him under his lungs, seizing. He fought upward, breaking through the surface in a gasp that barely made sound against the rain. That's when he saw it, a small wolf pup, half his size, staring at him from the shallows. Its fur was pale silver, almost blue under the stormlight. It tilted its head, curiosity glinting in amber eyes. Eli tried to crawl toward the bank, but the current caught his leg. His knee struck a submerged log. Pain shot upward, blinding. He went under again. When he surfaced, sputtering, the pup had moved closer, one paw in the water, then another. Eli froze, trembling. The pup reached out, sniffing the air, and let out a soft yip, neither threat nor fear, just something that sounded alive. He whispered hoarsely, half to himself, "You're not supposed to be here, and neither am I." The rain thickened, turning the world to mist. Somewhere behind the pup, an adult wolf howled deep, commanding, echoing through the gorge. The pack began to retreat toward the trees, but the pup stayed for one heartbeat longer, eyes locked on the shivering human. Then it turned, disappeared into the fog. Eli dragged himself to the shore, collapsed onto the gravel, heart hammering. He looked out into the empty river and whispered, "Did that really just happen?" By the time the storm cleared, the Alaskan coast had changed its color. The ocean shifted from steel gray to deep blue, and mist crawled along the spruce forest like breath on glass. Gulls screamed overhead. The air smelled of salt rain and fish, the perfume of this wild edge of the world. Dr. Eli Turner woke inside his tent, his hands still shaking from the night before. The cuts on his palms had scabbed over. His notebook lay open beside him, its pages warped with water. Scrawled across one of them in ink that had half bled away were 4 words. "Wolves that fish. Confirmed." He was 34 years old, a field biologist from Oregon State University, specializing in marine terrestrial interactions, the overlap between land predators and ocean resources. For years he had read studies about Canis lupus columbianus, the so-called coastal wolves of the Pacific Northwest. But sightings were rare, and photographic evidence even rarer. Until last night. Eli zipped up his jacket and stepped outside. The world was quiet except for the constant rush of water. His tent sat a few hundred meters from the mouth of the Kitasu River, where the tide pushed in and out twice each day. It was a place few scientists ever reached, too remote, too wet, too unpredictable. He stretched his sore leg and limped toward the bank. The morning light painted the water gold. A bald eagle perched on a driftwood stump scanning the waves for fish, and on the far side of the river something moved. At first, Eli thought it was a trick of light. Then he saw the same pale shape he'd glimpsed the night before the pup. It was crouched near the waterline, pawing clumsily at the shallows. Each time a fish flicked past, it leapt too late, landing with a splash that sent salmon scattering. The pup shook itself, sneezed, then tried again. Eli couldn't help but laugh quietly. "Persistent little thing," he murmured, and lifted his binoculars. Through the lenses, he caught every detail: the dark line along its muzzle, the seaweed clinging to its fur, the flick of its ears at each sound. He began recording field notes aloud into his small voice recorder. Behavioral observation. Day 13. Single wolf pup at river edge, approx. 6 months old, attempting solo fishing. Displays curiosity, low aggression toward human presence. Possibly separated from pack during storm. He paused, lowering the recorder. Somewhere in his chest, that old professional boundary, the invisible line between observer and participant, felt thinner than it should. He knew the rules of field ethics. No direct contact with wild animals. No feeding or rescuing without authorization from wildlife control. Maintain a minimum distance of 50 meters at all times. But then he remembered the look in those amber eyes last night. Not wildness, not fear, but something that looked like recognition. Later that morning, he met with a local fisherman, Sam Kootenai, one of the few permanent residents of this isolated inlet. Sam's family had lived there for generations, part of the Tlingit community. His weathered face broke into a grin when Eli mentioned the wolves. "You saw them fish, didn't you?" Sam said. "I did," Eli replied, still half in disbelief. "Then you've seen what most men here never do. Those wolves, they don't just survive off the land. They read the tides like we do. The sea feeds them, and they give it respect in return." Eli followed Sam's gaze toward the horizon. The tide had turned. Silver streaks of salmon shimmered in the current. "They call them Ganaks, the spirit wolves," Sam added. "If one crosses your path, it means you've been noticed by the land itself." That night, as the sun fell behind the mountains, Eli replayed those words in his mind. Noticed by the land itself. He wrote in his log, "Perhaps we're not here to study them, but to listen." He reviewed his footage, blurred frames of rainwater and gray shapes moving through mist. But one clip froze him, the pup half submerged, staring toward the camera. Its expression wasn't animal curiosity. It looked aware. Outside, the tide rose again, lapping against the stones. Somewhere in the distance, a faint howl echoed through the fog, long, steady, and mournful. The sound rolled down from the forest ridges, bounced across the water, and wrapped around the camp like a memory. Eli sat back, eyes closed. For a moment, he wasn't a scientist with data sheets. He was just another creature on this raw edge of earth, breathing in rhythm with the wild. He whispered, "Tomorrow, I'll find them again." The next morning would bring more than he expected, a test of courage, instinct, and the fragile bridge between species. The forest greeted the morning in silver light. Moss dripped from every branch, and the sound of rushing water filled the air like endless breathing. Eli packed his camera, waterproof notepad, and a thermos of coffee before hiking back toward the riverbank where he had seen the pup. His boots sank into the spongy soil, each step echoing the hush of the wild around him. The tide was lower today. The river's edge revealed patterns of fish scales and paw prints pressed deep in the mud, wolf tracks small and large, crossing over one another like calligraphy. Eli knelt, tracing a print with his gloved hand. "You were here," he whispered. A sudden rustle made him freeze. From behind a fallen log, the wolf pup appeared. It was smaller than he remembered, or maybe the vastness of the wilderness made everything look fragile. Its fur shimmered silver white, still damp from the tide. The pup sniffed the air, watching him with quiet curiosity. Eli slowly lowered himself to the ground, trying to look small, non-threatening. He remembered Sam's advice: never stare, never chase. Let the wolf decide. He set his camera down beside him, switched it on, and whispered into the mic. Observation log, day 14. Subject appears: healthy minor limp, on left foreleg, possible sprain from recent storm. Behavior: cautious, curiosity. Distance: approximately 20 meters. The pup stepped closer, nose twitching. Its amber eyes flickered with something like recognition. Eli resisted the urge to reach out. Instead, he removed his glove and placed his hand palm up on the wet stones. "It's okay," he murmured, voice barely audible over the river. "You helped me yesterday. I'm not going to hurt you." The pup's ears flicked forward. It took another step, then another. For a moment, time slowed the smell of salt, the low hum of water, the faint tremor in Eli's fingers. The pup stopped just short of touching distance, sniffed the air, and let out a soft whine. Then it backed away, vanishing into the brush. Eli exhaled, heart pounding. He had no footage worth publishing, but he had something far rarer: contact. He spent the next several days returning at dawn, sitting by the river, without moving, sometimes for hours. The pup always appeared, not every day, but often enough that Eli began to recognize its rhythm. It hunted small fish, gnawed driftwood, and once even barked at a curious otter. On the 5th morning, Eli noticed blood on the pup's hind leg. The injury looked shallow but fresh, maybe from sharp rocks or a crab trap. Instinct took over. He opened his field pack, removed a small medical kit, and tore a strip of gauze. Then he stopped himself. Protocol: no handling of wildlife, no interference. He stared at the bleeding pup. It limped slightly, trying to step into the water again, determined to fish despite the pain. "You're stubborn," he muttered, "just like me." Eli set the gauze down on a flat rock near the waterline, weighed it with a small stone, and backed away. The pup watched, cautious. Minutes passed. Finally, it crept forward, sniffed the fabric, and to Eli's amazement, pressed its leg against it, as if recognizing the gesture. The bandage slipped off quickly in the current, but something changed. From that day on, the pup no longer ran when he arrived. It waited. One evening, Eli sat sketching the river in his notebook when he felt eyes on him. He looked up. The pup was there again, closer than ever before. Its fur had dried to a soft gray hue, catching the light of the setting sun. Behind it in the distance, the rest of the pack emerged, 5 adults moving silently through the reeds. Eli froze. His breath turned shallow. The alpha female, large scarred eyes, sharp as flint, met his gaze. A long moment passed. The air thickened with tension. Then she looked away, giving a short, low growl toward the pup. The signal was clear time to leave. But before turning, the pup looked back at him, one last glance, long and deliberate, like a promise not to forget. That night, Eli couldn't sleep. The moon hung low above the sea, and every wave seemed to whisper that the wild had noticed him back. He turned on his voice recorder. Observation log. Day 18. First full sighting of coastal wolf pack. Pup continues to show curiosity. Potential bond formation. I know I shouldn't interfere, but if empathy is interference, then maybe we've misunderstood nature all along. Outside, a howl rose low, drawn out, and answered by others farther away, blending with the roar of the surf. Eli stepped out of his tent and looked toward the forest, where shadows moved like water. For the first time, he didn't feel alone. The days blurred into a rhythm of tide and wind. Morning brought the soft hiss of waves. Night brought the low hum of the forest alive with things unseen. Eli Turner had stopped keeping track of time. His world had shrunk to a stretch of riverbank, a notebook, and the steady presence of one silver-furred pup. By now, he had given it a name quietly to himself, Coda, meaning friend, in the language of a tribe whose stories once traced these same coasts. He never called it aloud. Names he knew carried weight. But writing it in his notes somehow made the bond real. Each dawn, Coda appeared near the same cluster of driftwood where the salmon gathered. Eli watched through his camera lens as the pup learned the rhythm of the river, the way salmon surface just before breaking against a current, the timing of the leap, the art of patience. Again and again the pup failed, yet it never gave up. One afternoon, a sudden downpour drove Eli to take shelter under a cedar overhang. Thunder cracked across the bay, and the river swelled dangerously fast. Through the sheets of rain he spotted movement, the small gray figure struggling against the current. "Coda," he shouted, before realizing what he'd done. The word tore from his throat without thought. The pup yelped, slipping on slick stones, then disappeared behind a wave of foam. Eli sprinted, heart hammering, slipping down the muddy slope. The rain stung his eyes, but he could just make out the pale shape tangled near a branch. He waded in waist deep, fighting the pull of the water, and scooped the shivering body into his arms. The pup was light, too light. It whimpered softly, head pressed against his chest. Eli carried it to his camp and laid it near the fire pit, wrapping it in a dry blanket from his pack. His hands trembled as he rubbed its fur, careful not to touch the wounded leg. "Easy," he whispered. "You're all right now." The fire crackled, casting orange light over fur that glistened with tiny droplets. Slowly, the pup's breathing steadied. It blinked up at him, then sneezed as if annoyed by his concern. Eli smiled for the first time in days. Tough little fisherman, huh? He knew the danger in what he was doing, both for himself and for the wolf. Direct contact could destroy months of behavioral neutrality. Yet, as he sat beside the fire listening to the rain hammer, the tent walls, the rules of research felt small compared to the quiet miracle breathing beside him. He spent the night awake, keeping the fire alive. By morning, the storm had passed, leaving behind a clean, glassy world. Mist curled through the trees, and the air smelled of wet earth and salt. Coda stirred, stretched, and shook off the blanket. Then, without hesitation, he padded toward the riverbank, looked back once, and slipped into the water. His limp was gone. Eli followed from a distance, camera in hand. Coda stood midstream, watching the salmon flash beneath him. When one broke the surface, he lunged this time with perfect timing. The fish flew from the water, flapping wildly, before landing on the pebbles. Eli laughed aloud. "You did it!" The pup tilted its head, as if proud of itself, then began tearing into the catch. For the next week, Eli documented everything: how the wolves coordinated fishing positions along the river, how juveniles waded downstream to catch the fish that escaped, how they rotated positions like trained hunters, not by chance, but by understanding. It was cooperation, not chaos. And it was beautiful. But the peace didn't last. 2 days later, an unfamiliar sound cut through the valley, the distant thump of helicopter blades. Eli looked up, his stomach tightening. The Wildlife Enforcement Division was surveying the region for illegal fishing traps and human-wildlife interactions. If they found his camp near a wolf pack, he could lose his research license. Worse, the wolves could be tagged or relocated, disrupting everything. He quickly covered the fire pit, packed his gear, and hiked deeper into the woods. Coda followed along the tree line, watching silently as he dismantled his tent. For the first time, Eli realized how easily the pup had grown accustomed to him and how dangerous that could become. He knelt, whispering softly, "You can't follow me this time. Okay, stay with your pack." But Coda didn't move. It stood still, head lowered, eyes fixed on his. A low whine escaped its throat, the sound of confusion of farewell unspoken. Eli turned away. "Go!" he said louder this time. The pup flinched, then disappeared into the fog. That night alone in a rocky hollow, Eli listened to the storm return. He thought of Coda, of how quickly trust had turned into something that felt like friendship, and he wondered if friendship with the wild could ever truly exist without breaking the very rules meant to protect it. When dawn came, he returned to the river's edge, unsure what he'd find. The water had risen again, tinted gold by the sunrise. Then, from across the current, he saw movement, not one, but several shapes. The entire pack was back, moving in a slow, synchronized line through the shallows. At the rear was Coda. The pup glanced up briefly, then turned to the water, pawing skillfully at the current. It caught a salmon and dropped it on the stones near Eli's side of the bank, a clumsy gift, half instinct, half memory. Eli's breath caught in his throat. He raised his camera, recording the moment. Observation. "Log day 25, he whispered. Subject rejoined pack. Displays learned fishing technique. Possibly recognizes human observer. Behavior cooperative." He lowered the camera and smiled. "Good job, little fisherman." Behind Coda, the alpha female howled, her voice rolling across the tide. The others joined in a sound ancient and haunting, like the heartbeat of the wild itself. Eli closed his eyes, letting the chorus wash over him. He knew this would not last. But for now, in that perfect balance between sea and forest, between human and wolf, something sacred held steady. The next week brought the kind of summer storm that Alaska is famous for, cold, heavy, and unpredictable. It rolled in from the sea without warning, turning the horizon to liquid steel. Eli Turner woke before dawn to the growl of thunder and the metallic scent of rain. The tent shuddered around him like a breathing thing. He stepped outside, pulling his hood tight. The world was a blur of wind and water. Waves crashed against the mouth of the Kitasu River, and the forest swayed under the force of the gale. He thought about packing up and retreating inland, but then he saw the first flash of movement along the riverbank wolves. They were there, despite the weather fishing, as the salmon ran in frantic numbers. It was a frenzy of motion, silver bodies leaping, wolves lunging, splashes breaking against the storm. The water had risen high enough to drown half the gravel shore, yet the wolves stood firm, their coats plastered flat, eyes locked on the current. Eli grabbed his camera. "Unbelievable," he whispered, setting it on a tripod beneath his rain poncho. Every frame looked like something from another world, wolves and fish, storm and surf, raw nature performing its oldest ritual. Then he saw Coda. The pup, no longer quite a pup, fought the current near the far side of the river, mimicking the adults. He was stronger now, confident, but the water was merciless. A sharp crack of thunder startled the pack. One of the adults bolted upstream, the others followed, barking sharply. Only Coda stayed behind, determined to hold his ground. "Coda." "No," Eli shouted before catching himself. The words vanished into the wind. He stepped forward for a better angle, his boots sliding on wet rock. The rain made everything slick, each step treacherous. Then a sudden slip. The camera tumbled, his foot twisted, and before he could grab a branch, he plunged into the torrent. The cold was instant, paralyzing. His backpack dragged him under, spinning. He surfaced, once gasped, and then went down again. Water roared in his ears, his vision blurred. He tried to swim toward the shore, but the current spun him sideways, slamming him against a submerged log. Panic clawed at his chest. He kicked, desperate for air. The world narrowed to sound, thunder, rushing water, and a cry that didn't belong to him. A howl. Through the haze of foam, something gray shot toward him. "Coda." The young wolf lunged into the current, jaws clamping onto the strap of Eli's backpack. For a moment, man and wolf were locked together, struggling against the current that wanted to drag them both away. Coda Eli gasped, barely conscious. "Let go." But the wolf didn't. It tugged, planted its paws against a rock, and pulled with everything it had. Inch by inch they moved toward shallower ground. Eli reached up, grabbed a branch, and with one last surge of strength, dragged himself half onto the bank. The wolf lost its footing, slipped, then scrambled beside him, drenched and panting. They lay there for a long time, man and wolf both trembling, both alive. The storm still raged, but it felt distant now, like a world away. Eli rolled onto his back, coughing water from his lungs. "You crazy little—" He stopped himself, laughing through the ache. "You saved my life." Coda nudged his arm with a wet nose, then sat beside him, tail twitching. The look in its eyes was something Eli would never forget, alert, cautious, but unmistakably aware. It was the same look from that first day, only deeper, older. The alpha female appeared moments later, followed by the rest of the pack. They formed a semicircle around Coda, sniffing, checking. Then the leader turned her gaze toward Eli. Her ears flattened slightly, but there was no snarl, no threat, just acknowledgement. For a fleeting heartbeat, Eli felt like he had crossed some invisible bridge, from observer to participant, from stranger to something closer. The rain began to ease. The clouds thinned, letting a wash of gray light spill over the river. Coda stood, shook the water from his fur, and howled. It wasn't loud or long, but it was clear, a single pure note that echoed through the valley. The rest of the pack joined in their voices, blending with the fading thunder until the whole world seemed to vibrate. Eli listened, tears mixing with rain. The sound wasn't wild or savage. It was alive, a song of existence itself. When silence returned, the wolves began to move. One by one, they slipped into the forest, vanishing between the trees. Coda hesitated, glancing back once. Then he followed. Eli sat there long after they were gone, the camera lying broken beside him. His leg throbbed, his body ached, but his mind was still clearer than it had ever been. He understood something now that no textbook could explain. Trust is not a gift, it's an exchange. That night, the storm passed. The stars came out bright, sharp, infinite. Eli built a small fire and sat by the river's edge, drying his clothes. The air smelled of smoke and salt. From deep in the forest, a distant howl answered the crackle of the flames. He raised his flask in a silent toast. "To you, Coda, the fisherman who saved the scientist." In the morning, he'd find his equipment scattered and half ruined. The data would be incomplete. But the story, the truth, was worth more than any research grant. The footage he managed to salvage would later show only fragments: the storm, the gray shapes moving through water, a silver blur that might have been a wolf or a ghost. But the moment itself, the pull of teeth on canvas, the warmth of life in the middle of chaos, would stay with him forever. And though he didn't know it yet, that rescue would start a debate far beyond the forest about empathy boundaries and whether humans could truly coexist with creatures they once feared. As dawn broke, the tide receded, leaving behind driftwood and silver scales that glimmered in the sun. Eli limped along the river, breathing deep. For the first time in years, he wasn't thinking like a scientist or a survivor. He was simply part of something greater, the ancient rhythm of sea and wolf, of hunter and prey, of balance. He smiled to himself. Guess I'm not the only one learning to fish. By the time Eli returned to Anchorage, the footage from Alaska had already begun to spread among his colleagues. What he had captured blurred as it was defied decades of scientific skepticism. Wolves catching salmon was rare enough, but a wolf saving a human, that crossed into legend. His email inbox overflowed. Extraordinary documentation, wrote one biologist. Potential behavioral bias, do not publish yet, warned another. And from the Wildlife Protection Bureau, subject violation of contact protocol, field incident report, required. Eli read that one twice. At the university, the research board called an emergency meeting. He sat before a semicircle of administrators' cameras, off expressions flat. His field jacket still smelled of smoke and salt. Dr. Turner, the director, began. "We've reviewed your footage. While the material is compelling, it's clear you breached standard protocol. Direct interaction with wolves feeding, touching, or influencing their behavior is a serious infraction." Eli tried to keep his tone steady. "I didn't feed them. I didn't stage anything. I was documenting a phenomenon that you nearly drowned," another interrupted. "And according to your log, a wolf made physical contact with you. You understand what that implies. If these animals lose their natural fear of humans, it can endanger both sides." He clenched his fists beneath the table. They didn't lose fear. They chose trust. "There's a difference." A murmur rippled through the room. Someone whispered, "Anthropomorphism." Another typed notes rapidly. "Be that as it may," the chairwoman concluded, "your permit is suspended pending investigation. You'll submit all raw data for review. Effective immediately, you are to cease field operations in Alaska." The gavel of bureaucracy struck harder than the cold ever had. That night, Eli walked along the harbor, watching the lights ripple on the black water. He replayed the storm in his mind, the strength in Coda's jaws, the look in those amber eyes. It didn't feel like interference. It felt like understanding. But science didn't measure understanding. It measured distance. He spent the following weeks reviewing his notes, editing clips for presentation, and responding to journalists who'd caught wind of the wolf that saved a man. Online opinions split sharply. One commenter wrote, "Proof that wolves are intelligent, empathetic beings. We've underestimated them." Another replied, "Fake. Wolves are predators. If it pulled him out, it was probably confused." Then came a call from Wild North Media, a nature documentary company. They offered to license his footage for an upcoming series. It was the opportunity of a lifetime and the beginning of another storm. Because once the story hit television, the Wildlife Bureau reopened his case. They demanded full cooperation, claiming his interaction could lead to dangerous tourism, people seeking their own wolf encounters. Eli met with Ranger May Carlson, a field officer sent to question him. She was pragmatic, sharp-eyed, and had seen more than her share of accidents caused by curiosity. "Dr. Turner, I've read your report," she said, flipping through her tablet. "You're lucky to be alive, but you also need to understand that pup's behavior. If it learns humans mean food or safety, it'll approach the wrong person one day. And we both know how those stories end." Eli nodded slowly. "I know. That's why I never touched it again after that night. I wanted to record, not interfere." She studied him. "You care about them, don't you?" He smiled faintly. "More than I should, maybe." Ranger Carlson sighed, softening. "Then do the right thing. Help us keep them wild. Write your paper. Show the world what they're capable of, but make sure it's clear that coexistence doesn't mean taming." He promised he would. Weeks passed. The storms of controversy began to fade, replaced by curiosity. Scientific journals debated his findings. Field researchers discussed coastal wolf behavioral adaptations, and conservationists cited his footage as proof of species intelligence and adaptability. Still, he couldn't shake the image of Coda standing in that river, a bridge between worlds. One evening, while organizing data, he received an email with no subject line. It contained only a single photograph. The sender was Sam Kootenai, the fisherman from the coast. The photo showed the Katasu River, calm beneath a pink sky. Near the edge, half submerged in water, stood a wolf. Tall, silver-gray gaze turned toward the horizon. No caption, no date. But Eli didn't need either. He knew that silhouette. He leaned back, heart pounding. For the first time since leaving Alaska, he allowed himself to smile fully. Coda was alive. He drafted a reply. "Tell the spirit guardians I'm keeping my promise. I'll let them stay wild." Then he closed the laptop and whispered, "Maybe some stories aren't meant to be owned, just witnessed." Outside his window, snow began to fall soft and quiet, like the sea remembering its own echo. Spring came slowly to Alaska, melting the edges of snowfields and turning the rivers back to liquid glass. A year had passed since that storm, but for Eli Turner, the memory of it hadn't dulled. If anything, it had deepened like an ache that never healed, only changed shape. His research suspension was finally lifted. The Wildlife Bureau, after reviewing months of data and testimony, reinstated his field license under one condition: no further contact with wild wolves. Observation only. Eli agreed, though part of him already knew the rule would be harder to follow than they imagined. He returned to the coast by bush plane that April, carrying lighter equipment and a heavier heart. The pilot, a friend from previous surveys, glanced at him as they descended over the emerald forest. Back for redemption or ghosts? Eli smiled faintly. Maybe both. The world below hadn't changed. Same glacial rivers, snaking through valleys, same driftwood-strewn beaches. Yet, when his boots touched the ground, he felt the difference. He wasn't here as a scientist chasing data. He was here to say goodbye. The campsite was still there, half reclaimed by moss. His old fire pit had filled with rainwater, reflecting the gray sky like a mirror. Eli unpacked in silence, listening to the waves. He had promised himself he wouldn't seek them out, but his eyes kept drifting toward the river's mouth, the place where everything had begun. That evening, as dusk settled, he heard it a howl. Faint, distant, but unmistakable. He froze. It rose once then, again echoing through the canyon. His pulse quickened. Could it be them? Could it be him? Before reason could stop him, Eli grabbed his jacket and started walking. The forest swallowed him whole. The air smelled of cedar and ocean spray. The ground, still damp from melted snow, muffled his steps. And then, through the trees, the river appeared wide, alive, gleaming with salmon already fighting their way upstream. He saw movement near the bend. A wolf, sleek and silver-gray, stood in the shallows. For a heartbeat, time fractured. Coda. The wolf looked stronger now, its coat, darker eyes sharp and steady. It wasn't a pup anymore, but something more, a hunter, a leader in its own right. When it turned, their eyes met across the distance. Eli didn't move. Neither did Coda. The river roared between them, but the silence that filled it said everything words could not. He reached into his bag and pulled out a small bundle, wrapped in netting, several salmon he'd purchased from local fishermen. Not to feed, not to tame, but to return what the sea had given. He knelt and tossed them gently into the current. The fish tumbled through the waves, glinting silver, before disappearing downstream. For a moment, Coda's gaze followed them. Then it looked back at him. The wolf's tail lifted slightly, not in aggression, but in recognition. "Go on," Eli whispered. "They're yours." The wolf stepped forward, testing the water, then waded into the current. Its movement was graceful, certain. It caught one fish easily, tossing it onto the stones, but instead of eating it, left it there halfway between them, as if answering the gesture. Eli's throat tightened. "So, that's your goodbye, huh?" He raised his camera hand, trembling. This time, there was no rush to document, no panic to capture proof. He filmed because he couldn't bear to forget. The lens framed Coda against the river, the mountains behind him, the low sun painting gold across his fur. A second wolf appeared at the edge of the trees, the alpha female, her muzzle white with age. The rest of the pack followed, watching silently. Coda glanced back at them, then toward Eli. One last look. Then he turned and trotted after them, disappearing into the forest shadows. Eli lowered the camera. His breath hitched, but he smiled through the sting in his chest. He sat on the same bank where he'd almost drowned a year before, feeling the rhythm of the river under his palms. The cold bit at his fingers, but he didn't move. Somewhere upstream, he heard the faint chorus of howls, a farewell, or perhaps a reminder that he was never really alone out here. He stayed until the sky went violet, until stars began to appear between torn clouds. Then he whispered, "Thank you, Coda, for saving me and for letting me go." Before leaving, he built one last fire. The flames crackled, throwing sparks into the dark. From his pocket, he took a small object, a tag from his ruined backpack, teeth marks still visible from that night in the storm. He placed it on the log and watched it burn. When the fire dimmed, he turned back toward camp, his steps slow but certain. The next morning, he packed up the last of his gear, zipped his journal shut, and looked once more toward the tree line. A soft wind carried the smell of salt and spruce. For a heartbeat, he thought he heard another howl, low, far away. But maybe it was just the sea. He smiled. Some sounds, he realized, don't need to be proven to be real. As he hiked away, a bald eagle soared above the river, tracing a circle where man and wolf had once met. The camera on his shoulder felt lighter now. The story, at last, was whole. A full year passed before Eli Turner returned to Alaska again. This time he didn't come as a researcher, but as a guest, a speaker at the annual Coastal Wildlife Symposium in Juneau. The event gathered scientists, filmmakers, and indigenous conservation leaders from across the Pacific Northwest. And though the city buzzed with chatter and lights, his thoughts were somewhere else, back on that fog-wrapped river, where silver wolves chased salmon through the tide. The symposium hall was bright and sterile, a world away from mudstorms and cedar trees. But when Eli took the stage, he carried that wilderness inside him. His presentation was titled "Coastal Wolves' Lessons on Adaptation and Coexistence." He began with silence. Then on the screen behind him, he played a clip, the single surviving frame from his damaged camera, a young wolf standing in the current, mouth open, salmon twisting mid-air. The audience gasped. Some leaned forward. Others simply watched, breathless. This, Eli said quietly, is not an image of curiosity. It's a portrait of intelligence and resilience. These wolves don't just survive on the edge of the sea. They listen to it. They read the tides, the seasons, even the movements of fish. They adapt without losing what makes them wild. He paused, scanning the faces in the crowd. A year ago, one of them pulled me out of a river during a storm. I can't prove intention. Science doesn't work with belief. But it happened. And that moment changed how I see everything, not as a scientist, but as a living being sharing this planet. The hall was silent, except for the faint hum of the projector. He ended with footage from his final trip, waves rolling over the Kitasu shore, salmon leaping, and just for a second, a gray shape disappearing into the fog. No names, no narration, just wildness unclaimed. When he finished, the audience stood and applauded. But for Eli, the applause wasn't the reward. The reward was knowing that the story would travel farther than he ever could, carried by others who might finally understand that coexistence wasn't theory. It was choice. Afterward, in the lobby, a familiar voice called his name. It was Ranger May Carlson, the officer who'd once interrogated him. She smiled, holding a small envelope. "You were right," she said. Coexistence doesn't mean taming. Inside the envelope was a printed report. New field observations from the Kitasu region. Wolf tracks near salmon runs, healthy pack activity, no incidents with humans. And attached at the bottom, a single photo taken by a drone crew. A large silver-gray wolf standing on a rock facing the sea. Coda. Eli traced the edges of the photo with his thumb. "He made it," he whispered. Ranger Carlson nodded. "Looks like your fisherman's still working." That night, Eli walked along the shoreline outside Juneau. The tide whispered against the stones, and the sky burned orange with the last light of day. He thought of Coda, how they'd met, how they'd parted, how each had learned something from the other, without needing words. He took out his recorder, the same one he'd used in the field, and pressed record one last time. "Observation log, final entry," he said softly. Subject, Canis lupus columbianus. Findings. The species demonstrates remarkable adaptability to coastal ecosystems. But the most valuable discovery wasn't behavioral. It was emotional, the realization that observation without empathy is just surveillance. To study nature, we must also respect it. He stopped letting the waves fill the silence. Then, almost smiling, he added, "Also, I owe one wolf a very big thank you." He clicked the recorder off. The next morning, before his flight home, Eli took a small boat out to an uninhabited island along the coast, a research reserve managed by local conservationists. There, he met Sam Kootenai again. The fisherman's beard was whiter now, but his grin hadn't changed. "You came back," Sam said, handing him a mug of strong coffee. "I had to," Eli replied. "There's one last thing I need to do." They walked to the river mouth together. The tide was high, carrying the same smell of salt and cedar that had haunted his dreams. Eli knelt at the water's edge and dropped a handful of salmon scales he'd kept from his old samples. They sparkled like shards of memory before sinking out of sight. Sam watched quietly. "You letting go?" Eli nodded. "No, just giving back." For a long moment they stood without speaking. Then far upriver, a sound broke through the wind, a single distant howl. Eli froze. The hair on his arms stood on end. The sound echoed once, then again, fading into the mist. Sam smiled. "Guess the spirits remember you." Eli's eyes glistened. Or maybe he just came to say good fishing. He turned toward the ocean, feeling the weight of the world settle into something softer. The storm that had once almost killed him had brought him here to understanding, to humility, to peace. He whispered into the wind, "Stay wild, my friend." The tide carried the words away. Somewhere beyond the trees, the howl rose once more, blending with the surf, the eternal duet of land and sea, of man and wolf. When Eli Turner finally returned home, Alaska stayed with him in the smell of salt on his clothes, the scars on his hands, and the quiet that never left his bones. Months passed, but every time it rained, he could almost hear it again. The rush of the Kitasu River, the splash of salmon, the soft whine of a young wolf. He often thought about how small the world had seemed in that moment, one man, one animal, bound by instinct rather than science. The experience hadn't made him famous, though the documentary later aired on National Geographic under the title The Wolves Who Fish. It made him something rarer, humble. He kept working, teaching young biologists not just how to measure nature, but how to listen to it. In every lecture he repeated the same sentence: observation is not enough. Empathy is the bridge that makes knowledge meaningful. Sometimes students asked about the wolf. Did it really save you? Did you ever see it again? He always smiled and answered honestly, yes, once. But that was enough. Eli's story spread far beyond universities. Conservation groups used his footage to promote coexistence programs for wolves, bears, and coyotes across North America. Indigenous communities shared it as a reminder of an older truth that the wild isn't separate from us. It's part of us. In one of his final journal entries, Eli wrote, "Wolves don't adapt because they want to survive. They adapt because the world changes and they listen." Maybe that's what we need to learn, not control nature, not fear it, but listen. That sentence became the opening line of a children's book inspired by his research, Coda and the River of Silver Fish. The book was illustrated with soft watercolor scenes, a boy and a wolf learning from one another beneath the rain. It reached classrooms, libraries, and conservation centers across the country. Children drew pictures of wolves and wrote letters saying they wanted to protect them. And so a story that began with fear ended in understanding. In his later years, Eli returned once more to Alaska, not to film or measure, but to walk. He visited the same riverbank where his camera had once fallen. The air was still sharp, still alive. He left no markers, no plaques, just a smooth stone etched with 2 words: "Still listening." That evening, as he watched the sun set over the water, he thought of all the things he had learned, and all the things the wolf had taught him, without a single word: patience in the face of failure, strength in the current, the courage to trust even when it's risky, the wisdom to let go when it's time. The tide crept up, touching the stone, carrying it slowly into the river. He smiled. Nature had always known how to keep what was truly hers. Somewhere far off, a howl rose across the valley, soft, distant, but unmistakable. It blended with the wind, then vanished into the sea. Eli closed his eyes and whispered, "Good fishing, my friend." The camera of the film would fade out on that moment, a lone figure standing by the ocean framed by mist, the horizon endless.